Welcome to the linear metal prep class. In this class, we're going to go over a lot of different things as far as prepping metal for epoxy, whether it be new metal or old rusted metal. We're going to go over different types of stripping, different types of blasting, different medias, using a metal prep system. We're going to go over different types of primers, what to put over bare metal, what not to put over bare metal, and why, as well as a lot of other really useful information as far as metal prep from a rusted old classic vehicle to nice bare properly prepped steel ready for epoxy. So once you've got your vehicle, you've got the metal work done, you've got a little bit of a mix of some new metal that you may have put in, some patches, some new panels, and you've got a bit of maybe the bottom and the inside, the firewall, things like that might be, you haven't really stripped them yet, you haven't done a whole lot at that point. So the first big step that I like to do after we do the major metal work is to blast the whole vehicle except for the skins. And there's an important reason for that. Generally, I like to sandblast, dry sandblast. So different medias come into play here. You can use sand, you can use crushed glass, walnuts. There's a soda blasting. There's a ton of different medias you can use, and some of them you can use only dry, some of them you can use only wet, some of them are a mix where you can use them dry or wet. And I typically like to do everything dry because when you do things wet, you get a lot of mud packed in between panels. You get, wet sand or wet media packed in between, say, your wheelhouse and your quarter panel, where they both kind of roll together like this, right in this void is packed full of sand and wet sand or wet media. And there's not a lot you can really do to get it out of there except spray water at it. And a lot of the wet blasting systems use a product in the water called Hold Tight 100 or something similar, which it will basically give you a window of opportunity to get some epoxy on the metal before it starts rusting. And I'm not so much a believer in that. I mean, there's guys that use it and love it. I just don't generally do that. I like to mechanically strip the outside panels, the quarters, or the roof skin, whatever, the exterior panels of the vehicle. I typically will mechanically strip, and what I mean by that is sanding them. We don't blast exterior panels, even with soda blasting and with blasting with water. Wet blasting things, you can still warp large panels, and I have had a few things wet blasted by professional blasters, and they almost always come back warped or damaged in one way or another that was not previously there, and that's from the blasting process. So when you have a blasted when you're blasting a piece of metal, you're creating a lot of heat. That sand or media, as it hits it, is creating a lot of heat, and that's where different medias come in. If you use something like walnuts, it's a very soft media. When it hits the metal, it kind of explodes and just dissipates. There is a product called Black Blast that I do kind of like to use on areas that, like the back sides of a hood or something, where you are going to be kind of sort of blasting at the bottom side of the hood skin. Same with deck lids are kind of very similar, a lot of them, where when you blast the shell, you're probably going to end up blasting through those little pockets and hitting the hood skin. And you can put duct tape there. A few layers of duct tape generally helps a lot with getting those areas not to warp when you're dry blasting. So dry blasting is what I believe to be the best way to strip a non-exterior panel. So I'll blast the entire inside of a car, the entire bottom of the car, inside the wheel tubs, basically everywhere that you're not going to mechanically strip. Blasting is a type of mechanical stripping, but when I say mechanical stripping, I mean sanding. Physically sanding the panel, trying to keep the heat to a minimum. Heat is the enemy in stripping. And when we go to mechanical stripping or sanding of the exterior panels, generally I'll take an 8-inch rotary wheel with 80 grit, sometimes 36, depending how thick of product. If you got a lot of filler on the car that you're trying to grind off, then I might go to 36 and I'll finish out with 80. But in doing that, you can create heat just like when you buff. You're creating heat, and that's what's doing the buffing a lot of the time is partially heat. But heat is the enemy. So right now we are not trying to warp panels. We're trying to keep things straight. We're going to take I'll generally start with 80 grit, and I'll work that back and forth slowly. The slower the better. If you try to just go at it and buzz it down, it's going to ruin your paper. It's going to plug your paper. And if you're stripping old enamels and old lacquers, as you heat them old paints up, they become almost like gum, and they immediately will plug your paper. So slow and steady wins the race when it comes to stripping exterior panels. And then, like I said, we don't sandblast. So at that point, in the beginning, I'll generally strip those big the quarters, the roof, things like that, and then we'll go to sandblasting. And then after blasting, we will kind of look everything over. We'll blast around all our welds, all our patch panels, make sure that we don't have any pinholes in our welds. And a lot of times what we like to do there is take a flashlight, have a guy on the inside and a guy on the bottom or the outside, wherever you're looking, and run a flashlight along all your butt welds and any welds that you have. If you can see light through a tiny spot, now's the time to weld it up, because if you're going to have a rust issue or a blister come back from a rust repair, it's most likely going to be because of a pinhole in the weld, because it's going to allow moisture up through the bottom, and it's your filler that you're going to eventually put over this weld is going to absorb that. And that's why a lot of guys prefer to use fiberglass, something like Duraglass or Marglass over a weld, because it is much more waterproof than a traditional polyester body filler. Another type of stripping is chemical stripping, where we would use say an aircraft paint stripper or some sort of aggressive chemical to chemically eat that paint and let it release from the metal. And the acting ingredient in a lot of those products is methyl ethyl chloride, which the EPA has decided is no longer needed in our industry. So this option, as far as stripping paint anymore, the naked gun that used to be really good for cleaning old guns that had been neglected, naked gun, the paint stripper, all that stuff is none of it works like it used to, because that methyl ethyl chloride was I'll say the active ingredient that really worked as far as stripping paint. But if you do decide to use a chemical stripper, what I generally like to do is make sure you stir it well, shake it well, and then I'll lather it all over the panel with a paintbrush usually, and then we'll cover it in plastic. And what that's going to do is allow it to basically bite in before it evaporates, because once that stuff dries, you're it kind of really gets real gummy, and you don't want to have to sand it off so much as use maybe a putty knife and scrape it off while it's good and wet and it's released that old paint. Then it will generally work pretty good. But like I said, the newer stuff, I've never had any luck with it since they took the methyl ethyl chloride out of that product. They just aren't the same. So on areas that are rusty, they might have some slight rust pits and things, like if you have I did a international travel all along quite a while ago that the hood skin was, the entire inside of the hood was the hood skin, same as like a Tri-5 Chevy, things like that. There's not a lot of structure to the inside of the hood. You can see most of the bottom of the skin when you open the hood, and those areas had been really pitted and whatnot. So we wanted to do our best to get all the rust out of those pits, but we don't want to sandblast that area, because it's just like blasting the top of the skin. We're going to ruin the hood most likely if we blast those areas. So what we used was a product called Clean 44. It's in the One Choice line from PPG, and in my opinion is a great product for chemically stripping rust. This is not a paint eater. This is a rust eater. This product will you sand and grind and prep as well as you can. Use a rust buster wheel or a whisker biscuit, some guys call them. Try to get down in there, clean that rust out of those pits as best as you can. And then what we do is use Core Clean 44, and that product it looks like clear jelly, almost like petroleum jelly. It's very thick, and basically you apply it like a paint stripper with a paintbrush, or it's clear when it comes out of the jug, and you apply it like you would a paint stripper, but only on the areas that you want it to eat this rust. If you have nice clean bare metal and you put it over that, it's not going to hurt it. You just have to make sure you clean this product back off well when you're done. So what we do is your affected area, say your area is 1 square foot that you have some little rust pitting going on, you can see the brown down in there, and you need to get it out. So we'll apply the Core Clean 44 to that area and then cover it in plastic. And I like to think about it like tinting a window or putting a decal on. When you put that plastic on, you want as least air bubbles in there as possible. One, air has oxygen in it, and if you can prevent oxygen from getting to this is best, but it will, same as the chemical paint stripper, it will allow it to stay wet longer. It will allow that product to work properly. This product needs to sit generally overnight to really work. It's not a 1 or 2 hour thing where like the paint stripper generally works within an hour or two. You can start scraping paint off. The Core Clean 44 is kind of a different animal because it's a rust eater. We put that plastic over it, generally go home, come back the next morning, take that plastic off, and all that clear gel that you put on there will be just black and brown. It'll look just nasty. And what I like to do from there is take some rubbing alcohol and clean that off. Should still be wet. You clean that off with some rubbing alcohol, and then if it still needs it, do the process again. And you repeat this process until you don't have any rust. Generally, I'll do it the first time, I'll clean it, I'll take a DA with some 80 grit, sand it, see what it looks like. If I think it needs another round, we'll do it again. Going back to mechanical stripping a little bit, when we sandblast, that is a mechanical strip because it is a physical rock hitting the paint, stripping it off. Mechanical / physical stripping. Chemical stripping is back to the chemical paint stripper, the Core Clean 44, things like that. So when we sandblast things, we're going to put a profile in that metal surface. So if you were to look at a sandblasted surface under a microscope, this depth may be, say, 1 to 2 mils in some cases, depending on the media you use. If we are sanding and mechanically stripping metal by sanding or with a DA, with a rotary, anything like that, you have to think about grits a little bit differently because metal's a much harder substrate than, say, body filler or primer or old paint. An 80 grit scratch in body filler may be much deeper than an 80 grit scratch in bare metal. So when we strip bare metal by sanding, we only will go up to 80 grit. Nothing finer than 80 grit ever on bare metal because of this. If we say we're going to go to 180, and in paint it might leave a 180 scratch, let's say just for ease it's 2 mils, a 180 scratch, where in bare metal that almost is non-existent. It almost begins to polish that bare metal because that bare metal is so hard, and that 180 rock is small enough that that hard metal almost immediately starts to dull that 180, and then you are essentially polishing the metal. You're not going to get a good bite when you prime that metal. And we're going to do a metal prep process over everything that we physically sand in general. In general, it's only the exterior skins, but when we sand any bare metal, whether it be steel or aluminum, we always go only as high as 80 grit. 36 grit would be acceptable, but generally 80 is a nice mix of aggressive but not so aggressive that you're going to have to deal with shrinkage later from that epoxy getting down into those super deep 36 grit scratches. That's generally why I like to choose 80. It's a nice coarse cut, but not so coarse that you're gouging or grinding the metal. When we start to think about what the next step is after stripping bare metal, we start getting into different types of primers. There's epoxy primers, there's etch primers, there's DTM polyester primers, there's DTM urethane primers. There's a lot of options out there nowadays as far as a first prime over bare metal. And generally what I do is epoxy. Epoxy is, in my opinion, the best bare metal primer there is. Epoxy comes in many different shapes and forms: sandable, non-sandable, high build, and non-high build. Just about every paint company makes multiple epoxies, and epoxies chemically are fairly simple. They're simple for the chemists to make, and they're simple to modify. And epoxy is not a breathable product, where like a polyester or a urethane is a breathable product. So when we start thinking about adhesion to bare metal, epoxy is generally the go-to primer of epoxy of whatever brand paint you use. I'm a PPG guy. I like to use VP 2050, F4921, DP90, DPLV50. There's a ton of different epoxies out there, and we'll go into that a little more if you look in the reading side of this class on that download. If you look at that in there, it goes a little bit more in depth into choosing which epoxy to choose. They all will work great as far as corrosion protection, but are you going to sand this primer, or are you going to, say you've got a bare metal part that's ready for paint? There's a different process for that. So we go over a little bit more about that in that read-along version of this class. But when we're thinking about adhesion to bare metal, we have a sandblasted profile. Epoxy, generally you're going to get anywhere from 1 to 2 mils per coat with a non-high build epoxy. Whereas etch primer, you may only get a 1/4 to a 1/2 mil per coat. And when you think about how deep this blast profile is, say we've got a fairly aggressive blast, say we've got 2 mils blast profile depth. When we go, if we were to put etch over this, what's going to happen is we're going to basically fill half of these voids. We're going to have these mountaintops are not going to be, after that etch dries, after those solvents leave and that etch shrinks to its dry film build, that etch primer is going to leave these mountaintops or these peaks of our profile unprotected. And then in general, after an etch, you would go to a 2K surfacer or something of that sort. Some people in the past were using polyester over etch, which is a huge no-no, which we talk more about in our prep and surfacing class. But as far as bare metal goes, etch out. Don't even use it. It's a thing of the past. Etch is really for the collision industry, and it's really only meant to be used over areas that are, maybe a 50-cent piece to a dollar bill in general. As far as it's meant to be a speed product for collision shops, production shops, things like that. Epoxy is always going to be the #1 option, in my opinion, because if you're getting 1 or 2 mils per coat, in general, over sandblasted epoxy or over sandblasted metal, I will take the blazer that we're going to show you in this video. I took F4921. It's a Delfleet epoxy, which is PPG, but it has excellent adhesion to bare metal and excellent corrosion protection. It's one of the top used primers by a lot of the, I'll say, top names of the industry. I know a lot of high-end guys, well-known high-end guys that are using the F4921, and then they'll leave that sit, and then they'll put 2050 over that a few days later, because they believe that the 4921 has far superior corrosion protection. And it's all really your opinion. They all work great, and it all depends on what your next step is with it. So keep this in mind when you're priming over blasted profiles. Generally, we don't sand the entire bottom of the car after we sandblast, or the entire inside, because when you blast, you are making a physical impression for your primer to bite into and to adhere to that bare metal well. Same with sanding. When you use 80 grit or coarser, you are putting a nice tooth into that metal for your next product to stick and adhere to well. So now let's talk a little bit about the DTM urethane primers and the DTM spray polys that are out there. In my opinion, they are not a DTM, because when you look at what a urethane is and what a polyester is, really nothing in those chemical makeups points you in the direction to believe that it would be good over bare metal. They are breathable products, and what I mean by that is, say we've got a film build of urethane or polyester. In this case, they both are going to act very similar. So we've got metal, we've got our primer, and then we've got environment. This is everyday air, water, weather. So we've got our metal, and then our urethane or spray poly primer. Now, these being breathable, if it's hot and humid outside, all these the humidity, the droplets of water in the air, they are actually, this primer is actually going to breathe and wick that moisture in, and eventually it's going to get down to the bare metal, and then you're going to have rust oxidizing, and then it's going to form bigger areas, and you're going to have blisters. I experienced this the first time many years ago when I was fairly green to this, I'll say. I used a DTM spray poly, and it was a Dodge Power Wagon tailgate. We didn't epoxy it. We went, it's just a tailgate, we'll just put it in this DTM spray poly. Well, this tailgate sat on the shelf for probably a month after we primed it in summer humidity, and we took it off the shelf, and there was multiple blisters of primer just flaking off of the bare metal. And when we cut them open with a razor blade, there was physical water in these blisters. And ever since then, I've never been a believer of a spray poly or any sort of urethane primer over a bare metal of any sort. So at this point with the K5, after we sandblast everything, we have done our testing with flashlights, filling pinholes, things like that in welds, and we did any metal work, any rust holes that we found during blasting, we repaired, and the inside and outside is, I'll say, pre-blasted. And at this point, we take it back outside and re-blast everything. And the reason we do this is bare metal will actually start to form microparticles of rust within 30 minutes of exposed to oxygen. What that means is after you sandblast something, within 30 minutes, it is generally, you may not see it, it may not be turning brown, and it does depend on humidity levels and whatnot, but there is microscopic particles of rust forming, and most epoxies have a rust inhibitor in them to fight that microscopic bit of rust. It will basically neutralize a very tiny amount of rust. You can't put epoxy right over rust. That is not what it's intended for. But as far as a micro blister of rust, that epoxy will lock that down and neutralize that. So at this point, we take this K5 back out, we sandblast everything for the final time, just kind of go over everything that we have even already blasted, just clean it up, put a fresh tooth into it, and make sure it's nice clean metal. And then from there, we basically take a blowgun, blow every orifice of this body, and it takes hours to blow all the sand out of the rockers and all the body cavities. We generally roll the vehicle back and forth, upside down if your rotisserie allows. We'll roll it upside down. You know, take a little hammer, kind of hit on some inconspicuous, very structural areas, and that'll kind of rattle any sand loose. As you blow, you might stick a vacuum in one end of a frame rail and blow on the other end. You just got to be creative on ways to get all this sand out. Once you have all that sand out, then you go right to epoxy. Don't touch this bare metal after you've sandblasted it. Don't wipe it. Don't do anything. If you wipe this bare metal, it's just going to shred the rag, and you're going to have so much dirt in your epoxy, which at this point doesn't matter so much because you're probably going to end up sanding all this again anyway before paint. But so on the inside and the bottom, the door jambs, things like that, of this K5, we use the Delfleet F4921 epoxy because of its excellent adhesion to bare metal, excellent corrosion protection. That's the epoxy that I chose to go with. And on the skins, we do something a little different, and we'll get into that when we get there. So we've got this K5 Blazer on the rotisserie at this point. We've done most of the metal work that we did. Had to make a bunch of sections of the floor pan and whatnot, but we did most of that while this was on the chassis. We put quarters on, rockers on, built the floor, fixed a bunch of the firewall stuff, added the few braces here and there, and at this point we put it on the rotisserie about a week ago. We blasted the bottom to make sure that we didn't have any rust holes and whatnot down there to fix, which we did. And now we've fixed those. We're done with the welding and grinding at this point. So now we've already sandblasted this, but just from it sitting, you can see there's some little rust coming back here and there in the deeper pitting areas and that. So at this point, we're going to come back out, sandblast this again. We're going to basically just kind of lightly wash over it, get all the brown off, make sure we got nice clean metal, and then we're going to epoxy the inside, the bottom, the firewall, everything but the quarters and the exterior skins, which we're going to do a DX metal prep system on, and we'll go over that when we get to that point. But today our goal is to lightly sandblast everything, get everything really nice and clean, and get some epoxy onto this thing. So yesterday we sprayed epoxy on everything but the outer quarter skins, and the reason we did that is we're going to do a metal prep process on the outer skins here. We have previously stripped the skins with 80 grit on a 8-inch rotary buffer type wheel. Basically, that's the fastest way to strip something, in my opinion. We don't want to sandblast this big quarter, because if we do, it's going to warp it. There's a lot of different medias and things you can use for blasting for stripping to not warp things, but in my experience, just about everything that I've tried or that we have had done by somebody else, it almost always warps at least a little bit. So a mechanical strip is the best route for a quarter, especially something this big and long and flat. So now we're going to come back in, we're going to DA this entire panel. We'll probably use one of these rust buster wheels, or whisker biscuits, a lot of people call them, up in this area around the pinch weld and whatnot. just to clean that up. We got some primer overspray from the jam. We're going to DA that off with 80, and then once we get this panel, I'll say visually very clean and to where I would say it's ready to prime, we're going to do a DX metal prep system on these quarter skins. So at this point, we've got the quarters cleaned up real well, DA'd with 80 grit. If you get real close, you can see all those swirls and all those marks. That's all the grit, the bite that we're talking about, the 80 grit scratch. We need a good deep scratch for that epoxy to bite into. And the epoxy we're going to use on this is a high build epoxy, VP 2050. It's very good corrosion protection. It's very similar to DPLV or the DPLF series epoxies, but in a high build sandable version. Generally, that's what we use over bare metal and then also over bodywork. So at this point, we're going to use the DX metal prep system, DX579, DX520. We are going to want to use hot water for this, and I'll explain a little more as we go through the process of why the hot water is important, and a little bit more about how to use these products. So now at this stage, we're going to go to the DX579, DX520 metal prep system. Depending on where you're at in the country and how much product your jobber moves, they may call it DX still. There may be some DX products still on the shelf somewhere out there, but for the most part now they've switched it all over to their one choice line and changed these part numbers to SX579 and SX520. They're the same product, relabeled basically in the one choice line. So either DX579 or SX579, they're going to be the same product. So just be aware of that. But as we do this process, the DX579 is a metal cleaner conditioner. What that's going to do, it's going to help do a final clean on the metal really well. It's going to neutralize any microparticles of rust that may exist on that panel that you can't see. It's going to help neutralize those, and basically it's going to prep that panel for the DX520 zinc phosphate coating, which is the second part of this metal prep system. So when we do use these products, the DX579, you do reduce with distilled water 1 to 2, which is kind of a weird ratio, 1 part 579, 2 parts distilled water. What I like to do is, reduce that, put it into a spray bottle or a squirt bottle of some sort, and then I'll actually preheat that mixture before I even put it on the panel, because cold temperature is our enemy right now. If you have DX579 or DX520 and you're using it with cold water, or you're rinsing it with cold water, you will probably have some browning, and that's because the phosphate and the zinc phosphate in these products will react with temperature. It will turn brown in colder temperatures. So when we rinse these products off of our bare metal, we're going to use hot water. The hotter the better. Very hot water, and we're going to do a full sheet rinse, and then we're going to wipe it dry and blow it dry immediately. Try not to let that hot water cool as it's on the bare metal before you dry it completely. So for this process, we start with the DX or SX579 preheated, squirt it on the panel, keep that panel wet, use a red Scotch-Brite, kind of keep rubbing it in, keep cleaning it, scrubbing that panel. We'll let that sit on there a couple minutes. We'll do a full wet sheet rinse with hot water, and then we will dry that completely. We'll dry it with some rags, then we'll come back, blow dry everything really well, and then we'll do the same with DX520. Now DX520 is not reduced with distilled water. If you use DX520 straight out of the jug, again, a good idea to kind of preheat it. Soak the bottle of 520 in a 5-gallon bucket of hot water or something of that sort. Heat that 520 up good as well. So what I've got here is a mixture of DX579 and distilled water. You mix this 1 to 2, 1 part DX579, 2 parts distilled water. And I've actually taken this and soaked it in a bottle of hot water to kind of preheat this. So when I use this product, I'm going to spray it all over this whole panel. I'm going to take a red Scotch-Brite and basically just wash this panel, just kind of scrub it good with this. I'm going to let this sit about 2 to 3 minutes. Not letting it dry. You don't want to let it dry. If you see a spot that's drying a little bit, squirt a little more on there, rub it in, keep this product wet the whole time you're using it, and then we're going to rinse this with hot water. And the reason for that is the chemicals in this, specifically phosphate, reacts with cold water and it can turn brown and look like rust. And you may have this if you don't, if your water's not super hot, or as you're drying it, that water's on there, it's cooling down. You may have some browning here and there. That's not anything to worry about. That's just kind of the nature of these products with the phosphate. And if they do get cold, they will turn brown a little bit. And we're actually going to be using hot water on bare metal here after we prep it with DX579. We're going to do a full sheet rinse, which means a complete sheet of water over the whole panel. And then we're going to take some paper towels and dry it as best we can, and then we're going to take a air blower and blow it dry immediately as fast as possible. I'm really not worried about getting water on any of the rest of the vehicle at this point. It's an epoxy. We've blasted epoxy inside the rockers, inside the box rails, everywhere that there would be bare metal on the inside of any panels. So at this point, I'm going to spray some of this across my panel, and like I said, I'm just going to rub it in. And if you do get this over top of other epoxy or other paint, this product isn't going to hurt it. It's not going to bite in or eat any. This is not a chemical stripper by any means. It's a metal prep system. So as I rub this in, we're just going to keep this nice and wet, this whole panel. I'm using a red Scotch-Brite. You can use a gray Scotch-Brite or really any sort of scrubbing abrasive. I wouldn't use sandpaper, I would say, but you just want something that's going to help you even out that DX579 onto the panel, and also kind of help you start to scrub it in a little bit and just kind of get in those scratches and really clean everything well. As I'm doing this, you can see some streaking and stuff. There's, we're cleaning this panel as we're doing this. This is a metal prep cleaner and conditioner, the DX579 is. And what this product will do is if we have any microscopic bits of rust that the human eye can't see, what this will do is neutralize that rust. If you use this product over a visible piece of rust, it will actually turn black. And what that means is that rust has been neutralized, and at that point it's somewhat safe to epoxy over. So now I'm going to just let this sit, kind of keep rubbing this around for a couple minutes, and then we're going to go to a hot water rinse and an immediate dry. So now we've let this sit for a couple minutes. I'm going to give it kind of one more little rub over, kind of spread that product around evenly, and then we're going to immediately rinse it with hot water. Now I've got my hot water hose actually running out the window right now to make sure that the water is hot immediately when I need it, because the water in the hose may be getting cooled off before it gets to the end of the hose if you let it sit for a while. So now I've got my hot water hose at the ready here, and I'm going to immediately rinse this with a sheet of hot water. A full sheet, a full rinse from top to bottom. And you can see that product. You can kind of tell where the water starts and where the DX starts. You can see the difference in the product.
And as you can see, it's made that metal a little more uniformly gray, a little darker gray. Now we're going to do a real nice hot sheet. A good thorough rinse. You want to make sure you get all the DX off of the panel. If you don't, you can have issues down the road, because after this step, after we dry this, we're not sanding it anymore. We're really not touching it anymore, other than, you know, once we're done with the DX520, we're going to go right to epoxy, basically. So now what I'm doing, you can see this panel steaming a little bit. That means that water on there is good and hot. So I'm going to try to dry it as quickly as possible before that water gets cold and starts browning this panel, is what's going to happen if I let that water get too cold. I'm just using paper towels for this. But I will dry the entire panel as best I can with a towel, paper towel, a clean rag, something, and then I'll go to a blow gun afterwards to get all the water out of the edges and cracks and seams and whatnot. So now I've got my panel pretty well dry. I'm going to take an air blower and blow this all off. So now I've got my panel dry with the paper towels. Now I'm going to take this air blower and basically just blow any extra water that might be down in these holes or around the taillight opening or hanging out in this wheel opening area. Fingertips coming off of the metal, and that's going to help grab that epoxy. It's going to help that epoxy stick to the metal good. It's going to help the epoxy feather out better. If you get to a stage in bodywork, say where you're needing to feather out an area down bare metal again, you know, maybe you've got a little high spot or something, it'll help just tremendously help adhesion to bare metal. Is what the metal prep process, corrosion protection and adhesion to bare metal. So even though we've metal prepped this and it's clean, I'm still going to wipe it with a wax and grease remover. After we've done our metal prep, we don't sand anymore. We really don't touch it except for a wax and grease remover wipe. Some guys like to use acetone, which is acceptable. It's a much harsher cleaner on bare metal. That's really the only time that I would ever use acetone is over bare metal, because it is very aggressive. But I like to get the panel fully wet, and I'll take one cloth and I'll wipe this panel until it's dry, or we get the wetness off of the panel, I'll say. And then I'll take another one once it starts drying like this. I'll take another wipe, and basically we just keep wiping this panel until it's totally dry. And then at that point, we go ahead and spray our epoxy.